The scalpel was in his hand before the decision arrived. That was how mastery worked. The body moved ahead on accumulated knowledge, while the conscious mind was still reading the room, still cataloging the cold fluorescent geometry of the operating suite, still running the pre-incision inventory that Nathan had long since stopped consciously registering. 1,100 procedures had written themselves into his hands. He knew the angle before he applied it. He knew the pressure before he thought about it. The whole economy of a discipline made fluent. You stop rehearsing and start being, and the being handles the mechanics while something deeper handles everything else. But standing over Diane Marchetti that Tuesday morning, Nathan stopped. Not because the instrument slipped, not because his hand shook. It did not. He stopped because he looked at the scalpel in his palm and understood, with the specific clarity that arrives only when you stop manufacturing explanations, that he did not recognize the person holding it. The hands were his, the skill was his. The 22 years of accumulated certainty were, on paper, entirely and demonstrably his. But the story that connected all of that to the man standing in the room, the story that said, yes, this belongs to you, this is yours to carry, was absent. 3 seconds of internal silence in a room full of surgical noise. Nobody noticed. Diane Marchetti was off the table by noon and speaking with her daughter by 3. There is a version of this story where Nathan files those 3 seconds under anomaly and drives home and forgets it by the following Tuesday. The brain offers that version with generosity, a door marked probably nothing, and the latch gives easily if you press it. Nathan pressed it. The door did not close the way it usually did, and in the gap it left, small and dark and persistent, something he had never once thought to examine began to move. The most dangerous event in Nathan Cole's life was not the surgery that went wrong. It was the one that went perfectly right, and the thought that arrived in the scrub room afterward, quiet and self-contained and impossible to dismiss. If everything you know about yourself was assembled by the same mind that just froze, how much of it is actually true? Based on the book Cybernetics by Maxwell Maltz and adapted into narrative format to make its ideas practical and engaging. Chapter 1. The Surgeon Who Forgot His Own Hands. When the architecture of identity starts running without you, Nathan Cole woke at 4:43 that morning. 17 minutes before his alarm, he lay still without fighting it, listening to the building. Downtown Boston had its own nocturnal frequency at that hour. Delivery trucks on Boylston Street, the distant compression of a garbage vehicle on its early loop, the low, constant hum of the HVAC system that he had stopped consciously hearing sometime in year 3 of living here. He registered all of it now. His brain was running at full voltage before the coffee, before the light, before any of the ordinary scaffolding that held a morning in its shape. He had a 7:15 procedure. A pituitary tumor resection, the kind of surgery the OR staff called the needle, meaning the margin for error was the width of a thread, and the approach required moving through terrain that did not forgive approximation. Nathan had threaded it 47 times without a complication. He got up and made coffee the way he always made it, one measure short of what the package recommended, water just below the boil. He stood at the kitchen window while it brewed and watched a man in running clothes wait at the intersection below, with his hands braced on his knees, catching his breath. 2 pigeons contested something on the fire escape across the street. Nathan watched without thinking. Unhurried, his residents called him. It was not a trait he had been born with. He had built it carefully and over years, against a temperament that ran fast and hot. A neurosurgeon who reacts makes errors. You do not react, you respond. The difference lives in the fraction of a second between stimulus and choice, in that sliver of interval where either the situation runs you or you run it. Nathan had spent 2 decades making himself into someone who ran it. He poured his coffee and was halfway to the couch when the thought arrived. Not a worry, not an intrusion, just a question, dry and self-contained, sitting in the center of his mind with the quiet authority of something that had been waiting for space. Do you still know how to do this? He stopped in the middle of the kitchen. The question had no clinical basis. He had performed this procedure 47 times. He had run more technically demanding surgeries the week before without incident. His hands were steady, his chart clean, his outcomes consistently above departmental benchmark. There was no rational foundation for the question to exist. And yet it existed, with a weight that did not diminish when he turned to examine it. He sat down, drank his coffee. He delivered to himself the explanation the brain offers when it wants to close a door. early wake, incomplete sleep cycle, the kind of neurological noise a demanding body produces when the cycle has not fully resolved. He delivered it with the same measured confidence he used on patients during informed consent procedures. He almost believed it. He had a ritual for mornings that carried higher cognitive stakes, a practice he had maintained since residency. He would sit at the kitchen table with a blank notepad and spend 10 minutes reviewing the procedure in his mind, not technically but spatially. The operating room, the patient's position, the arc of the approach, the specific micro-decisions that a surgeon of his experience anticipates before they arrive. Not anxiety management, preparation. The distinction had always mattered to him. One was a response to doubt. The other was respect for complexity. He opened the notepad and sat for a moment. Then he closed it and stood up and walked back to the window instead, which he had never done on a procedure morning in 22 years. He registered the deviation without being able to explain it. The coffee was still warm. The procedure was in 3 hours. The ritual had been available to him, and he had walked away from it, and he was not sure whether the walking away was a choice or a symptom. The operating room at 6:50 was exactly as it always was. The cold that hits you at the threshold, not uncomfortable, just enough to mark a change in the category of space. The light that flattens shadow without eliminating it. Diane Marchetti was already draped and prepped. The monitors running their quiet metrics on a woman who had waited 7 months for this morning, who had a daughter in the waiting room, who had called the hospital at 11 the night before, just to confirm the appointment time. His chief resident, Park, ran the pre-op checklist with the efficiency of someone who had made no missed steps a personal standard. Nathan gave correct responses at the correct intervals. He asked 2 questions. The answers were accurate. He stepped to the table. The instruments were arranged to his left in the order he preferred, a preference so well established among the surgical staff that the scrub tech had stopped asking and started simply knowing. Nathan reached without looking, the way you reach for a light switch in a room you have lived in for years. He stopped. Not a tremor, not a flinch. His hand was completely still. The instrument was correctly placed. Every element of the external architecture of the procedure was in order. What stopped was the story. For 22 years, Nathan had carried one narrative into every operating room. I am the most qualified person in this space for this specific task. Not arrogance, precision. Arrogance is puffed up and defensive, a thing that collapses under pressure. What Nathan carried was structural. A load-bearing truth assembled piece by piece from 1,100 completed procedures, from the specific feel of a discipline mastered not quickly, but across years of iteration and failure and correction. He had never needed to think about it. It was the ground beneath him. The ground was gone. For 3 seconds, he would count them later, return to them in the scrub room and in the elevator, and at 2 in the morning staring at the ceiling, the story was simply not there. The instruments were his, the patient was his, the room was his, the body of knowledge was entirely and demonstrably his, but the person who claimed all of that as belonging to him, who inhabited it as rightful operating territory, was absent from the room. The feeling was not fear. It was stranger than fear. It was absence without explanation, a sudden legibility gap in a document he had been reading fluently for decades. He recovered. Park noted nothing. The procedure ran without incident. Diane Marchetti came off the table clean and would be home by the weekend. Nathan drove home in silence and did not understand what had happened. In the days that followed, the ghost showed up in places he did not expect. A department meeting on the 3rd day, where he found himself waiting slightly longer than usual before offering his clinical opinion on a contested case, and where the waiting felt unfamiliar, a hesitation he would not have recognized in himself 6 months earlier. It was not that the opinion was uncertain. The opinion was clear. The hesitation lived in the space between having the opinion and offering it, a space that used to be instantaneous and was now something else. A conversation with Park after rounds in which she asked him a question about surgical approach, and he gave a correct and complete answer, and then noticed, in the silence that followed, that he had delivered it with a quality of tentativeness entirely foreign to him, not in the content of the answer, in the frame around it. The content said, "Here is what I know." The frame said, "I am not entirely sure this belongs to me anymore." There is a distinction most people spend their entire lives failing to make, not because it is subtle, but because it is so foundational it hides in plain sight. The distinction is between what you know and what you are. What you know lives in the conscious, retrievable mind, in training and memory, and the demonstrable record of your performance. It can be audited. When someone questions your competence, you produce evidence, credentials, outcomes, years of practice, the testimony of people who have watched you work. Knowing is defensible because it is external. It has a paper trail. What you are is something else. It is the image, the internal portrait, assembled not from credentials, but from the accumulated weight of experience, failure, recovery, criticism absorbed and praise withheld, moments in rooms where you expanded and moments in rooms where you contracted. The portrait is not a summary of your capabilities. It functions as an operating system, running beneath the conscious mind, determining before any decision is consciously made what level of capability you will actually reach for and what version of yourself you will bring into the room. Think about the last time you acted in a way that did not match who you thought you were, held back when everything in the room expected you to move, froze when the situation had already decided you would not. Most people file those moments as anomalies, bad days, not enough sleep. What if they are not anomalies at all? What if they are the most accurate data your system ever produces? Consider what happens in a job interview. You have prepared. You know the answers. You have run through the questions, articulated the relevant experience, thought through the examples you will use. The preparation is real. And then the moment arrives, the interviewer leans forward and asks the question, and what comes out is not the answer you prepared. Something smaller, something that hedges at the edges, not because the knowledge was inadequate, because the image delivered a different instruction than the preparation. Or the conversation you have been meaning to have for weeks, the one with your manager about the direction of your work, or with your partner about something you have been carrying alone. You know what you need to say. You have rehearsed the words, and then you sit down across from the person, and the words come out softer than you intended, more accommodating, and you leave the conversation having said approximately everything except the thing you went in to say. The knowledge was there. The preparation was there. The image overrode both of them. Nathan did not have language for this yet. What he had, driving home through the early afternoon, was the raw fact of 3 seconds and the unsettling absence of any explanation that did not require him to look somewhere he had never looked before. He went back to work the next morning. The following 4 days of procedures ran clean. No hesitation. His hands moved with the accuracy his record reflected. An outcomes audit would have found nothing to flag. On the surface, nothing had changed. But Nathan made his living distinguishing between what a surface showed and what was running underneath it. Underneath it, running without announcing itself, was a loop he had not been carrying before Tuesday. A recursive question that the analytic mind kept trying to close and some deeper mechanism kept reopening. He called it the ghost, not because he was drawn to metaphor. He used the term because it was technically precise. A ghost signal in neural imaging is a reading that appears on the scan but cannot be attributed to a known anatomical source, present enough to alter the baseline, diffuse enough to resist direct localization. The ghost in Nathan's system behaved exactly this way. Present in the morning when he reviewed the day's schedule. Present in the scrub room, in the elevator, in the brief empty interval between 2 procedures when his body was resting and his mind was supposed to be resting too. It was not fear of failure. He had failed before. He had cases that went sideways despite doing everything correctly, had held conversations with families in the aftermath that required a kind of language he had learned the hard way. He knew what fear of failure felt like. It had a forward-facing urgency, a sharpening of the edges of things, a quality of heightened preparation. This moved backward, not forward. It questioned not the outcome of the next procedure, but the legitimacy of the person who would perform it. Not, will this go wrong? But, are you actually who you have been telling yourself you are? That question, once it installs itself, does not respond to evidence. Nathan spent 3 days feeding it evidence. 47 successful procedures, 2 decades of outcomes data, the demonstrable record of a career built with precision and care. The question acknowledged none of it. It sat underneath the record, at the level where the operating system ran rather than the level where the outputs were measured. On the 3rd day, he tried something that came naturally to him. He addressed the ghost through performance. He reviewed his procedural notes going back 5 years. He pulled outcome data and studied it with the granularity he used for departmental research. he requested a voluntary peer review of his last 6 cases, which surprised his department chair and raised no concerns. He ran through his preoperative preparation with more deliberateness than he had practiced since residency, not because the preparation was lacking, but because he wanted the record to be unambiguous, wanted to force the evidence into a pile large enough that the question could not survive it. The ghost survived all of it. This was instructive. The evidence was real. His competence was real. The record was genuinely clean. And the question that ran underneath that record remained unchanged, unaffected by any amount of objective evidence stacked on top of it. Whatever generated the loop was not reading the record. It was operating from somewhere else by a different set of rules, with access to information that the paper trail did not contain and could not speak to. You cannot solve a thermostat problem with a performance review. Nathan did not know this yet in those terms. He learned it empirically, over 3 days of attempted counter-evidence, in the way practitioners of demanding disciplines learn things, through the persistent refusal of reality to match the hypothesis. Here was the specific shape of the error in Nathan's attempt. It was not wrong in spirit. Building the record, auditing the outcomes, running the preoperative preparation with deliberateness. All of that was sound professional practice. The error was not in the activity. The error was in the assumption about what the activity could address. Performance addresses the output. It has no access to the setting that produces the output. You can improve the output to any degree and the setting remains unchanged, running its calibration from a layer below the work, patient and invisible, and entirely unmoved by the quality of what the surface produces. Nathan had been trying to change a number by arguing with the display. The number lived somewhere else entirely. On the 5th day, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror at 6 in the morning and looked at himself for longer than hygiene required. Not the morning inventory, collar level, eyes clear, the functional audit of a man who has places to be. Something else. The way you look at imaging when a preliminary read has flagged something and you need to spend more time with the image before moving to the next step. He looked without a conclusion already assembled. What he saw was a 51-year-old man who had built his sense of self entirely on demonstrated performance. The logic had always seemed correct. You prove yourself through repetition, and the repetition becomes identity. You do the work at high quality across enough time, and eventually the doing and the being merge. The competence stops being something you perform and starts being something you are. You no longer need to motivate yourself separately from the work. The work carries the belief. Standing there, he saw the error in that logic for the first time. The competence was real. What was not stable, what had apparently never been stable in the way he assumed, was the image, the internal portrait, the Nathan Cole that the other Nathan Cole consulted every morning before deciding what was and was not possible that day. That portrait was not a fixed credential, not a diploma on a wall that said once and permanently, "This is what you are worth." It was a living document, continuously revised by forces he had never monitored with the same rigor he applied to everything else in his professional life. What had written the revisions? He stood at the mirror and thought about it with more patience than he expected to bring to it. His father, a civil engineer who treated emotional expression the way he treated structural redundancy, as something included only when code required it, had told Nathan exactly once that he was proud of him. At the medical school graduation in the parking lot, while Nathan's mother was photographing the building, one sentence, real, meant, and then surrounded on every other day of their relationship by a silence that was not hostile but was complete. The pride existed, the silence existed. The image had given the silence more square footage, a fellowship application he had not received in second year. Not a catastrophic failure, not the kind that changes a trajectory. Just the ordinary painful experience of wanting a specific thing in a specific program and not receiving it, and filing it internally as a temporary setback, and moving forward with the efficiency that residency demanded. His mind filed it as temporary, the image filed it differently. A marriage that ended not with rupture but with a slow exhalation. 12 years of two people who had chosen well but drifted in directions. Neither had named until naming was all that remained. He had been a better surgeon during that marriage than he had been a husband, and he had known it, and the knowing had taken up residence in the portrait. None of these were tragedies. They were the ordinary materials of a human life at a level of professional exceptionalism. But each had taken a turn with the portrait, and the portrait did not distinguish between significant revisions and small ones. It accepted all of them with the same quiet impartiality and incorporated them into the baseline. Here is what Nathan did not understand yet, and what most people never understand about the image they carry of themselves. It does not merely influence behavior. It sets the ceiling and the floor on what behavior is even attempted. Maxwell Maltz, working from observations of his plastic surgery patients in New York in the early 1950s, eventually compared it to a thermostat. A thermostat does not evaluate the weather outside. It maintains a set temperature, and the system works continuously to close the gap between the current state and the set point. Turn the setting up and the system heats. Turn it down and it corrects in the other direction. The thermostat does not judge. It does not motivate. It holds the number and runs the machine. Your self-image is that thermostat. It holds a reading, not a temperature, but a level of what you are capable of on a Tuesday morning when the pressure is real and the patient is waiting, what rooms you belong in, what version of yourself you are allowed to bring to a problem that matters. Perform below the setting and the system pushes you back toward it. Perform above the setting and the system corrects in the other direction through 1,000 small adjustments invisible to any external audit, through hesitations and second thoughts, and the particular quality of self-consciousness that feels, from the inside, like appropriate humility, but is actually the thermostat running its function. The ghost in Nathan's system was not a psychological aberration. It was a maintenance mechanism doing exactly what it was built to do. The problem was not that he had performed below his capability. The problem was the opposite. At some point across 22 years of building a career whose quality exceeded what the image had decided he was worth, the system had noticed the discrepancy and begun closing the gap. Nathan had been operating above his thermostat for years without knowing the thermostat existed. He went to the hospital library that afternoon. This was unusual enough that Okonkwo, the librarian, who had worked the fourth-floor stacks for 11 years and could identify the building surgeons by the pattern of their footsteps in the corridor, looked up from his terminal when Nathan pushed through the door and registered something in his expression that constituted, for Okonkwo, a notable departure from his practiced neutrality. Nathan moved to the shelves without a specific title. The psychology and behavioral science section occupied a corner that received the afternoon light at an angle that made the spines difficult to read. He scanned without knowing what he was looking for, which was itself unusual for a man who had spent a career moving toward identified targets. He found the book almost by friction. Its spine cracked from use, pushed slightly forward from the shelf as if replaced in a hurry, the cover worn in a way that marked it from the books around it. He pulled it and turned to the first page. The margins of the opening chapters were covered in a handwriting he did not recognize. Not academic notes. These were arguments, question marks deployed with emphasis, the word but circled twice on page 14. An arrow on page 22 pointing to a passage with the marginal note, "This cannot be right." Someone had been here before him, wrestling with the material, pushing back against it, with the resistance of a reader encountering something true and not yet ready to accept it. He sat at the reading table near the window and opened to the introduction. Maltz opened with the observation that had driven him for years. Most of his plastic surgery patients experienced a transformation that extended far beyond the physical correction. Change the external defect and something inward shifted too, as though the corrected face had given permission for the self to be corrected along with it. Patients who had structured their entire existence around a feature they hated came back into his office carrying themselves differently. A woman who had never held eye contact in a waiting room returned 3 weeks post-surgery and held a conversation with her head up. A man whose birthmark had governed the direction of every room he entered came back looking, in Maltz's word, free. But some were not. The surgery equally clean, the correction equally complete. Those patients returned behaving identically to who they had been before anesthesia. The same posture, the same deference in conversation, the same invisible architecture of limitation in their bearing. The corrected face and the unchanged person, coexisting without apparent connection, as though the face and the self operated on entirely separate systems that did not communicate. Maltz spent years with this discrepancy before he named what he had found. He had been operating on the wrong surface. The face was never the source of the limitation. The source was the image the patient carried of themselves, assembled across a lifetime from experience large and small, from what had been said and what had been withheld, from the interpretations the mind had placed on events, and then treated permanently as facts. Change the face without changing the image, and the image ran the machine. What Maltz came to understand about the image was not merely that it existed, but how it had been constructed. The process was not deliberate. Nobody sat down in childhood and decided on a self-assessment and then maintained it consciously for decades. The image assembled itself from the accumulation of interpreted experience, from what children were told about themselves, and what those tellings meant in the internal record, from what they succeeded at and what they failed at, and which of those experiences received more weight than the data warranted. A child praised for intelligence and then failing a test does not simply update the data point. The failure arriving against an established expectation gets amplified. A child told, through action or inaction or the particular gravity of silence, that something about them is insufficient files the insufficiency as structural rather than temporary. The image is not assembled from the events themselves. It is assembled from what the mind decided the events meant. And what the mind decides in the early years tends to become the operating assumption that runs everything else. The image always ran the machine. Nathan set the book down 2 hours later and looked at the Boston evening through the library window, the light going sideways across the buildings in November, making everything briefly cinematic before the dark closed in. Okonkwo shelved, returns at the far end of the room without making sound. Nathan sat with one thought. For 22 years, he had applied rigorous calibration to his craft, constant refinement, ongoing audit of technique, careful attention to outcomes and their implications for future performance. He had done everything the conventional model of professional development required. He had improved continuously, in every measurable way. Not once had he turned that same precision toward the image, the internal portrait, the thermostat that ran the system underneath all the technique and all the knowledge and all the demonstrated capability. He had improved the tools without examining the operating system that decided how the tools would be used. He had logged the hours without asking whether the person logging them had an accurate assessment of what those hours were building toward. He had performed at a level that exceeded the image's setting without ever understanding that a setting existed. He had assumed the image would update itself through the accumulation of evidence, the way a correction to a patient's record supersedes the previous entry. The correction is made. The old version is archived. The new version becomes operative. That was not how it worked. The image was not a passive record waiting for new information. It was a system with its own logic, its own rules for what evidence it admitted and what it filtered out, with a momentum that did not reverse, simply because the surface outputs improved. He drove home through the early dark and let the thoughts settle, without trying to resolve it. What stayed was not the diagnosis. His mind had the clinical efficiency to recognize a correct diagnosis once he landed on one. What stayed was the question underneath it. If the image had been built by forces he had never monitored, by experiences filed under categories that made them easier to carry, rather than more accurately understood, then the question was not only how to correct the current miscalibration. The question was whether he had reliable access to how the machine had been built in the first place. A thermostat you do not know exists runs the house at whatever temperature it was set to by someone other than you, in a season you do not remember, for reasons that no longer apply. The house has been heating and cooling and adjusting for years in the service of a setting you never chose. Every time you tried to make the room warmer, every accomplishment and completed procedure. And morning, you performed at the level your credentials reflected. The thermostat ran its correction and brought the temperature back, not because the setting was right, because the setting was set. Nathan set his phone on the night table. He had a 7:30 procedure in the morning. His hands were steady. His chart was clean. In every external measurement, nothing had changed, but somewhere in the operating system of Nathan Cole, a thermostat was holding a number that no one had deliberately chosen. It had been assembled by accident and repetition, and the specific gravity of experience left unexamined, a number composed from a father's silence and a second-year failure, and a marriage that ended with an exhalation and 1,000 other data points the image had collected and weighted and incorporated across 51 years. And everything Nathan Cole had ever been capable of had been running within the limits of that number, without knowing it existed, without knowing it could be changed. Chapter 2. The Machine That Aims. On the hidden mechanism running every decision you think is freely made. Nathan had been returning to the library every evening that week. Okonkwo had stopped looking up when he came through the door. The book was thicker than it looked. Not in page count, but in what each page opened. Nathan had the habit, developed over years of reading medical literature, of moving through a text once for the architecture and then returning to specific sections with a highlighter and a legal pad. He had stopped using the highlighter by the third night. The margins of his legal pad were filling up with something other than notes, questions, arguments. The word but circled 3 times on one page, which reminded him, with a specific discomfort, of the handwriting already in the margins when he first found the book. He was reading about guidance systems, not medical ones, military ones. And the connection felt strange until it did not. In 1948, a mathematician at MIT named Norbert Wiener published a book about the science of control and communication in machines and living systems. He called the science Psycho-Cybernetics, from the Greek word for helmsman, the person who steers. The central idea was this: complex systems, whether mechanical or biological, achieve their goals not by planning every step in advance, but by continuously monitoring the gap between their current state and a target state and adjusting their behavior to close that gap. Each deviation from the path triggers a correction. The correction is not the result of intention. It is the result of feedback. A torpedo does not need to know where it will end up. It needs to know where it is now, where the target is now, and whether it is closing the gap or widening it. The torpedo steers because the system keeps asking one question, closer or further. Every answer generates the next adjustment. The guidance is automatic. It requires no operator in the loop. Set the target, release the mechanism, and the mechanism runs. Maltz had read Wiener and recognized something the engineers had not considered. The human nervous system operated on the same principle, not metaphorically, structurally. The brain functions as a self-correcting guidance system, monitoring the gap between a person's current state and a target and generating behavior that attempts to close that gap. The behavior is automatic. It does not require conscious effort. Conscious effort, the kind that feels like trying, often interferes with it. The target the system corrects toward is the self-image. Nathan set the book face down on the reading table and looked at his legal pad. He had spent his entire career thinking about goals. Goals were the frame he had always used. The residency program, the fellowship, the surgical ranking, the outcomes record. Goals were things you set consciously, pursued deliberately, checked off when achieved, and replaced with larger goals. The model had seemed complete. Goals explained how he had gotten where he was. It had not occurred to him that goals and targets were different things. A goal is what you consciously pursue. A target is what your system is actually aimed at. The distinction seems small until you look at the gap between what someone consistently says they want and what they consistently arrive at, and you notice the arrivals match something other than the stated goals. The man who says he wants closeness but keeps choosing partners who are unavailable is not failing his goal. His servo-mechanism is succeeding at its target. The woman who says she wants visibility in her career but keeps finding roles behind the scenes is not making a series of unrelated choices. She is closing the gap between her current state and the setting her image has given the system to correct toward. The system does not care about your conscious goals. It corrects toward its target. Nathan had spent 22 years setting goals and pursuing them with the discipline his training demanded. Beneath all of that, a guidance system had been running on a target he had never chosen and had barely glimpsed. The surgical excellence, the outcomes record, the unhurried calm in the OR, all of it was the servo-mechanism at work. Not toward the target he had set consciously, toward the one the self-image had set automatically, which raised the question he had not yet asked. What exactly was the system aimed at? The answer arrived, unexpectedly, 3 days later in OR 3. His most gifted resident was a 28-year-old named Torres, who had come to Nathan's program from a medical school in California with the kind of dossier that circulates quietly among department chairs before the person arrives. Technically, Torres was the best second-year resident Nathan had supervised in 2 decades. His spatial reasoning was exceptional, his motor control precise, his recall of anatomy complete. In simulation, he was flawless. In low-stakes procedures, he was close to flawless. In high-stakes procedures he failed, not dramatically. Torres did not freeze the way Nathan had frozen. Torres did something more subtle and more telling. He became technically perfect and clinically wrong. He executed every individual step with irreproachable precision and made a sequence of small judgment errors that, taken together, added up to the wrong procedure. Not incompetence, a different kind of problem. The hands knew exactly what to do. Something above the hands was making different decisions. Nathan had watched this pattern for 6 months without understanding it. He had given Torres more feedback, more simulation time, more low-pressure cases to build confidence. Nothing had changed. On the morning of the 3rd day after returning to Maltz, he stood in the observation gallery above OR3 and watched Torres assist on a case that was 1 level below the resident's technical ceiling and 2 levels above his psychological one. Torres's hands were perfect. His sequencing was wrong. The attending corrected him twice, quietly, with a particular economy of language that experienced surgeons use when they do not want to destabilize a trainee mid-procedure. Torres accepted both corrections with the composure of someone trained to accept corrections with composure, and then made a 3rd error. Nathan watched from the gallery and felt something shift in his understanding. Not about Torres. About the mechanism. What Torres had was not a skill problem. It was not a confidence problem in the ordinary sense of that word. It was a target problem. Somewhere in the self-image of this technically exceptional resident, the target was not success at the highest level of surgical demand. The target was competence at a level just below that, with a layer of correction built into every approach to anything above it. The servo-mechanism was working exactly as designed. It was correcting toward what the image had set it to correct toward. A level of performance that confirmed what Torres already believed about himself under pressure. This is the part the conventional model of professional development does not account for. We assume that skills, once acquired, can be deployed to the ceiling of their capability. We assume that training and feedback and experience write directly into performance. We assume that the gap between what someone can do in simulation and what they do under pressure is a gap of preparation. The gap is rarely preparation. The gap is the self-image running its correction. Torres was not failing to perform at the ceiling of his technical skill. His servo-mechanism was succeeding at performing at the ceiling of his image's setting. Every error he made mid-procedure was the mechanism doing its job, closing the gap between his performance and his target. The target was simply pointed at the wrong thing. Nathan took the elevator down from the gallery and stood in the corridor for a moment. The fluorescent hum of the hospital filled the space around him. What he was looking at in Torres was what Maltz had been looking at 50 years earlier in the surgical suite, except from the opposite angle. Maltz had seen patients whose corrected faces did not update the image. Nathan was looking at a resident whose expanding skills had not updated the image. The pattern was identical. The surface changed. The target held. That night in the library, he found the passage he had been circling around for a week without knowing it. Maltz wrote about an experiment conducted with basketball players. One group practiced free throws physically every day for 20 days. A second group practiced them only in imagination, spending the same amount of time each day visualizing themselves at the free throw line, performing the motion correctly, watching the ball arc and drop. A third group did nothing. At the end of 20 days, the first group improved by 24%. The third group showed no improvement. The second group, the one that had practiced only in imagination, improved by 23%. 1% difference between physical practice and imagined practice. Nathan had been taught, across 22 years of training and the accumulated logic of a surgical culture built on demonstrated outcomes, to distrust anything that could not be physically demonstrated and measured. He was right to distrust it in most contexts. The operating room did not run on imagination. It ran on technique, on accumulated physical competence, on the reliable translation of knowledge into action. This was not vague. This was a measured result with a specific and reproducible mechanism. The reason imagined practice produced results was anatomical. The brain's nervous system cannot distinguish between a real experience and one that is vividly and repeatedly imagined. When you imagine performing a physical action with sufficient specificity, the neural pathways involved in that action fire in patterns functionally identical to the patterns fired during actual performance. The imagination is not a shortcut to the real thing. For the nervous system, it is the real thing. This was the mechanism behind the self-image's power. The image was not a belief about yourself, stored passively somewhere in memory. It was an active, continuous imagination, running in the background at all times, of a specific kind of person performing in a specific way. Every time you imagined being the kind of person who hesitates before speaking, the neural pathway for that hesitation fired. Every time you imagined being the kind of person whose hands belong in an operating room, the pathway for that belonging fired. The imagination did not predict the performance. It generated it. What this meant for Nathan's 3-second freeze was something he had to sit with before he could hold it steadily. The freeze had created an experience, a vivid, specific, emotionally charged experience of the version of Nathan who did not fully belong at the table. And the brain, with its structural inability to distinguish real from imagined, had incorporated that experience into the active imagination running the self-image. The freeze had not been a symptom of the image changing. It had been a contribution to a process that was already running, a contribution that pushed the image's target in a specific direction, and the servo-mechanism had adjusted its correction accordingly. He had been trying to fix the symptom. The symptom had already become a cause. Maltz called it the failure mechanism. The same servo-mechanism that drove the basketball player's improvement, that had built Nathan's surgical excellence over 22 years, that guided Torres's hands with irreproachable precision, could be set to guide toward failure just as reliably as it guided toward success. Not failure in the dramatic sense, failure in the cybernetic sense, a system reaching its target. If the target the image had set was a version of yourself that underperformed under pressure, that hesitated before speaking, that needed one degree of external confirmation before committing to a decision you already knew was correct, then the servo-mechanism would correct toward that version with the same efficiency and automaticity it used to build anything else. The mechanism did not know the difference between a target you had chosen and a target that had been set for you by the accumulated interpretation of your experience. It did not evaluate. It corrected. The evaluation, the question of whether the target was worth correcting toward, was entirely your responsibility. And most people, most of the time, did not know the target existed. Nathan thought about Torres again. The resident had not chosen a target of performing below his technical ceiling under pressure. He had not sat down and decided that high-stakes situations would reveal a version of himself that was not quite sufficient. The target had been built from the specific history of Torres's encounters with high-stakes situations. From every moment those situations had ended in an error that confirmed a story. From every correction that had been absorbed as evidence of something structural rather than something situational. The failure mechanism was running on a target Torres had never seen. Here is why willpower does not solve this. Willpower operates at the level of conscious intention. It is the part of you that decides to try harder, to be more deliberate, to push through resistance and perform at the level you know you are capable of. Willpower is real. It has genuine force over short intervals, and in situations where the gap between the image's target and the desired performance is small enough to bridge through effort alone. The servo-mechanism is not operating at the level of conscious intention. It is operating at the level of automatic correction. Automatic correction is faster, more consistent, and more durable than conscious intention. You can decide to run through the hesitation 100 times, and each time, the moment your conscious attention moves elsewhere, the mechanism reasserts its correction. The target does not change because you try harder. The target changes when the image changes. The image changes, as the basketball experiment made clear, not through argument and not through willpower, but through experience, real or vividly imagined. This was the shape of the trap Nathan had been in for the week since the library. He had understood intellectually what was wrong. He had named the image. He had named the target. He had built, in the privacy of the reading room, a complete theoretical understanding of the mechanism that was running him. None of it had moved the mechanism 1 degree. Understanding a thermostat does not change its setting. You have to reach over and turn the dial. He spent an hour that night, the legal pad full on both sides, tracing the specific route his failure mechanism had taken. The mechanism was not global. This was the first thing that distinguished it from the kind of diffuse self-doubt that shows up in every corner of a life. Nathan's failure mechanism was targeted, precise in a way that now struck him as almost elegant in its economy. It ran in the specific space where his highest-level capability intersected with the question of whether he deserved to occupy it, not whether he was capable. The clinical, factual question of capability had never been in dispute. The question the mechanism kept asking was narrower. Does someone like you get to be this good? He traced it back to the fellowship he had not received. Not the event itself, but the story the event had written in the image. He had told himself, consciously, and with the practical efficiency of a first-year resident who had no time for prolonged self-examination, that the outcome was a temporary setback in a long trajectory. He had believed this intellectually, but the nervous system had filed the experience differently. As a data point for a story it was already building about the relationship between Nathan Cole and the rooms where the highest-level work happened. The story was not that he was incompetent. The story was more specific. He was the kind of person who got close to those rooms and did not quite get in. His father's silence had written the first draft of that story. The fellowship had added a chapter. The marriage, or more precisely the particular absence that had characterized the final years of the marriage, had added another, a chapter about a man who prioritized the room where he was most certain of his belonging over the room where his belonging was uncertain and had to be earned in a different way. Each contribution had been small. Each had been incorporated into the image with the same automatic impartiality. And the sum had set a target that 22 years of surgical excellence had never been able to override, because the excellence and the target were operating on different levels of the system and had never been in direct conversation with each other. The excellence was real. The excellence had always been real. And the excellence had been running within the limits of the target the whole time, like a river that has carved its channel wide and deep, but still runs inside banks it did not choose. He put the legal pad down and looked at the ceiling of the library. The pattern, once you saw it clearly, was everywhere. It was not Nathan's pattern specifically. It was the human pattern, the one Maltz had been tracing for years and had named with the precision of a surgeon who finally understood which structure he had been cutting around rather than cutting through. The self-image sets a target. The servo-mechanism corrects toward it. The conscious mind sets goals and pursues them and makes real measurable progress, and then something corrects. A hesitation. A frame of tentativeness placed around a correct answer. A question that does not get asked in the meeting where asking it would have mattered. A decision deferred one day past the point where deferral is still wisdom. None of it visible from the outside. All of it, the mechanism running. Nathan had been calling it the ghost for a week because it behaved like a ghost signal, present but unlocatable. He could locate it now. It was not ghostly. It was mechanical. A guidance system with a target set below the level of his actual capability, correcting continuously and automatically toward that target, generating the specific deviations he had been cataloging as symptoms of something mysterious. There was nothing mysterious about it. The torpedo was following its guidance system. The system was running correctly. The target was simply wrong. He thought about what it had cost, not in dramatic terms. In simple arithmetic, if the servo mechanism had been correcting toward a target set below his actual capability for 22 years, then the gap between what he had achieved and what was available to him was not a small gap. It was not the gap between good and very good. It was the gap between a career performed at the ceiling of a self-image and a career that could have run at the ceiling of an actual capacity that had never been allowed to operate without the correction in play. He was not a person who trafficked in regret. Regret required a belief that the past could have been different, and 22 years in medicine, where outcomes were frequently determined by factors outside anyone's control, had taught him to accept that cleanly or not survive the work. But this was different from regret. This was an inventory. A clinical assessment of what the mechanism had cost, not in bitterness, but in the way a diagnostician accounts for the cumulative impact of an untreated condition on a patient's functioning over time. The condition had been running for 22 years. The cumulative impact was real, and the most expensive part of it was not what the mechanism had prevented him from achieving externally. It was what it had prevented him from experiencing internally, the specific kind of ease that comes when what you are doing and what the deep system believes you deserve to be doing are in alignment. He had been close to that ease for 22 years. He had not been inside it, and this was where the pattern stopped being about Nathan and started being about something broader. Every person carries a servo mechanism. Every person has an image that sets the target. Most people go through their entire lives, operating within the limits of a target they did not deliberately choose, set by the specific history of their interpreted experience, running its correction below the level of their conscious awareness. They make progress, real progress in the direction of their goals, and then the mechanism corrects. The gap between what they achieve and what they are capable of is not a gap of effort or talent or opportunity. It is a gap of target. The question is not whether your servo-mechanism is running. It is running. The question is what it is running toward. And that question, once you ask it honestly, is one of the most destabilizing questions a person can sit with, because the honest answer is rarely the one they expect. The musician who plays brilliantly in rehearsal and tightens under the lights of performance is not suffering from nerves in the ordinary sense of that word. His servo-mechanism is correcting toward a target that says, the visibility of this room exceeds what your image has authorized. The writer who produces clean, confident prose in private and hedges every sentence in the presence of an audience is not experiencing a skill failure. She is experiencing a target being enforced. The executive who runs internal meetings with precision and loses clarity in the room where the stakes are highest is not a different person in different rooms. She is the same person with a guidance system, aimed at a level of performance calibrated for rooms where the stakes are lower. Each of these is the same mechanism running the same correction toward the same kind of target, and in each case, the person experiencing it has spent years, assuming it is a problem of effort, of preparation, of practice, of finding the right technique. It is none of those things. It is a target problem. And target problems do not yield to effort. They yield to something else entirely. What does your hesitation tell you about your target? What does the particular shape of your avoidance reveal about what the image has decided you deserve? What is the gap between your highest demonstrated performance and your consistent performance? And what specific story has that gap been closing toward? Nathan did not answer these questions that night. He wrote them on the legal pad and put the cap on his pen and sat with them in the particular quality of silence that a question achieves when it has finally been asked correctly. He walked out of the library at 9:20 and stood at the window at the end of the 4th-floor corridor, looking at the Boston night. The city was running its own automatic correction, the traffic finding its paths, the lights cycling through their sequences, each system doing what it had been set up to do without anyone in the loop making individual decisions. He had never thought of the city this way before. He thought of it now. He knew what was wrong with his guidance system. He knew what the target was and how it had been set and what it was costing him. He had built, over 7 evenings in a hospital library, a complete and accurate diagnosis of the mechanism that had been running beneath his career. In medicine, diagnosis was the beginning of treatment, not the treatment itself. The most precise understanding of a pathology did not change the pathology. Understanding a thing and changing a thing were two separate operations requiring two different kinds of work. He had learned this in his first year of residency, and he had taught it to every resident since. He knew this. He had known it before the library, before the ghost, before the Tuesday morning freeze. What had changed was not the knowledge. What had changed was the clarity of what needed to be understood first before anything else could move. You had to see the target before you could change it. You had to name the mechanism before you could redirect it. You had to understand what the torpedo was aimed at before you could reset the guidance. Nathan Cole walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the parking garage. The mechanism was still running. The target was still set. The thermostat still held its number. But he was watching it now. He could see the gap between where the torpedo was headed and where it needed to go. That gap had a name. And named things in his experience were the only things that could be changed. Chapter 3. The resistance. When everything you know how to do makes the problem worse, 3 weeks after the library, Nathan began what he called, in the privacies of his legal pad, the program. He had done what he always did when he identified a technical problem that required a systematic response. He built a protocol. He read everything Maltz had written. He followed the citations backward into the research they rested on, found the studies on motor imagery and mental rehearsal in athletic performance, found the rehabilitation medicine literature on visualization in neurological recovery, found the experimental psychology that had been quietly accumulating for decades around the principle that the nervous system could be retrained, through imagined experience, as reliably as through physical experience. He built a picture of the mechanism from its theoretical foundations up, the way he built a surgical approach. Not from intuition, but from evidence. By the end of the second week, he understood the program as well as any non-specialist could understand it. Then he began. The practice was simple. 15 minutes each morning, before coffee, before the phone, before anything that constituted the day's demands. He would sit at the kitchen table, close his eyes, and build, as specifically and sensorially as he could, the image of himself in the operating room. Not the operating room of the freeze. A different one in which the story was intact, in which the Nathan at the table was the Nathan who belonged there, whose hands held the instrument with the settled confidence of someone for whom the question of belonging had already been answered. He would hold the image for as long as it would hold, then begin again. The first morning lasted 4 minutes. The image kept breaking. Not breaking catastrophically. Not collapsing into the freeze. Breaking the way a signal breaks when the frequency is slightly wrong. A flicker, then static, then the image would stabilize, and then the flicker would return. The version of himself that Nathan was trying to construct, the surgeon whose ground was intact, kept fragmenting into the version he was trying to replace. The two images occupied the same space, and the newer one was the weaker of the two. This was the first thing that surprised him. He had expected resistance. He had built the expectation of resistance into the protocol, had allocated time for the resistance, had prepared, with the methodical thoroughness that defined his approach to every difficult task, to push through it. What he had not prepared for was this specific form, that the deliberate attempt to build the new image required holding the old image in mind as the thing being replaced, and that the act of holding it in place strengthened it. Every time he sat at the kitchen table, and the fragment of the freeze appeared and he noted it, and returned to the new image, the nervous system filed a data point. Here is the version that arrives when you attempt to construct the other one. He kept the practice for 3 weeks. The image did not get cleaner. The ratio of stable image to fragmenting image stayed roughly constant through week 1, improved slightly in week 2, and in week 3 returned to approximately what it had been on the first morning. The fragmentation had a specific texture. It was not the texture of distraction, the mind pulled away by something more interesting. It was the texture of intrusion, of something arriving uninvited from within the structure he was trying to build. He would hold the image of the operating room, the table, the instruments, the particular quality of air in that space, and then, without clear transition, the image would include the specific quality of stillness that had preceded the freeze. The instant before the 3 seconds, the way the room had looked in the moment before the story disappeared. Not like remembering the freeze. Like the memory of the freeze was the stronger image. The one the nervous system had filed at a deeper level. And the new image was a surface construction that the deeper one could break through without effort. This told him something important. Not about the new image he was building. About the depth of the one he was trying to replace. He did not abandon the practice. He was not a person who abandoned practices because they were difficult. But he began, with the clinical precision that he could not turn off, to suspect that the practice itself was the problem. In immunology, there is a principle called immune rejection. When a foreign element enters the body, the immune system mounts a response proportional to the perceived threat. The more structurally significant the foreign element, the more vigorous the response. A splinter gets a local reaction. An organ transplant requires systemic suppression of the immune response because the body will destroy the thing it needs if the defense is allowed to run unchecked. The self-image operates on a similar principle. Any attempt to install a substantially new image, one that diverges significantly from the existing one, triggers a defensive response proportional to how deeply the existing image is entrenched. The response is not a sign that the change is impossible. It is a sign that the change is significant. If the resistance is strong, it means the existing image has been structural for a long time, woven into the operating system at a level of depth that makes replacement feel, to the system, like a genuine threat to its integrity. Nathan was not dealing with a surface belief. He was attempting to change a component that had been running for 51 years, reinforced by the specific history of a man who had built extraordinary competence on a foundation of quiet insufficiency. The resistance was not a malfunction. It was the system doing exactly what it had been designed to do. defend its current architecture against foreign elements. He understood this. He had arrived at it not from Maltz, but from watching the image not change for 3 weeks, and asking, with the diagnostic patience he brought to every failing treatment, what the failure was telling him. The second event in the OR happened on a Wednesday morning in the 4th week. Not a freeze. Something worse than a freeze. The procedure was a spinal decompression, technically lower stakes than the pituitary resection that had started all of this. A procedure Nathan had performed more than 200 times in 2 decades. He entered the OR with the deliberate intentionality he had been practicing, the conscious construction of the story he was trying to install, the narrative of the surgeon who belonged, held in mind as a container for the performance he was about to give. For the first 20 minutes, it held. He was performing well. His hands were accurate. The sequencing was clean. And then he knew he was performing well. The knowing broke the automaticity. A surgeon operating at the ceiling of their skill is not thinking about the performance. The performance is happening below the level of conscious monitoring, through the automatic mechanism that training has made fluent. It runs without direction the way a fluent reader reads without sounding out letters. The moment you become aware of the reading, the fluency breaks. Nathan had spent 4 weeks in conscious, deliberate construction of the image of himself performing, and what the construction had done, without his understanding it until this moment, was shift the performance from the automatic mechanism to the conscious monitoring layer. He was watching himself instead of being himself. And watching, in the middle of a surgical procedure, is the most reliable way to break what you are watching. He slowed. Not in a way that compromised the patient, not in a way that required intervention from the attending or from Park, but in a way that required the scrub tech to ask quietly if he needed anything, and in a way that registered in the specific quality of the room's silence that OR teams generate and read without words. He completed the procedure. He took 11 minutes longer than his baseline. Park said nothing during the case. She said nothing after it either. Which was more telling than words, he sat in the scrub room for 15 minutes before he trusted himself to have a normal face in the corridor. He ran the sequence backward the way he ran any procedure that had not gone as expected. Where in the timeline had the performance begun to deteriorate? Not when the slowdown became visible to the room. Before that, the deterioration had started. When he became aware that the performance was going well, and the awareness had introduced the monitoring layer. The monitoring layer had been present because 4 weeks of deliberate visualization practice had made him acutely conscious of his own performance as something to be watched and evaluated in real time. The practice had sensitized him in exactly the wrong direction. It had increased his awareness of what he was doing, rather than returning him to the state below awareness where the automatic mechanism ran without interference. He had made himself worse at the thing he was trying to fix. Not through carelessness, through the wrong application of the right idea. The quality of what he felt in the scrub room was not shame, though it had the temperature of shame. It was something more precise, the specific sensation of a treatment that should work producing a worse outcome than no treatment at all. He had identified the pathology correctly. He had designed the intervention correctly. He had applied the intervention with the discipline and consistency his training demanded. The outcome was a second event, worse than the first in one specific way. The first had happened while he was doing nothing to prevent it. The second had happened while he was doing everything he knew how to do. He had made the immune response worse by provoking it. The trying had not protected him. The trying was possibly the mechanism by which the second event had occurred. And that meant something about the relationship between effort and the change process that he had not fully understood from the reading, had understood intellectually, but not in the way you understand something when your body teaches it to you in a surgical suite in front of 5 other people. The failure of the intervention was not evidence that the intervention was wrong. He held on to this with the care of a surgeon, handling a structure he was not yet ready to remove. The intervention was right. The understanding was right. Something about the way he was applying it was wrong, and the wrongness was not in the content, but in the quality of the application itself. It was in the trying. 3 days after the spinal procedure, he was asked to consult on a patient in the neurology ward. The patient was a 60-year-old mathematics teacher named Serrano, who had suffered an ischemic stroke 7 months earlier. The acute phase had resolved without permanent deficit. Imaging at 3 months and at 6 months showed the neural architecture intact. Every functional assessment Serrano had completed over the past 2 months had returned results within normal range. The neurology team's note was clear: full neurological recovery, no residual impairment, cleared for return to normal activity. Serrano had not returned to any normal activity. He would not drive. He would not teach. He would not be in a room without another person present. He had reduced his diet to 3 foods because they were predictable and safe. He slept with the light on. He structured every hour of every day around a single principle. The stroke could return, and when it did, he needed to be somewhere it would be found and managed before it killed him. He had been cleared by 2 neurologists and a cardiologist. He had read the reports. He understood what they said. He could not make himself believe them. Nathan sat with Serrano for 40 minutes. He walked through the imaging results with the specificity and care that the situation required, the kind of communication where you do not simplify but you do translate, where you give the patient the real picture rather than the comfortable version, because the real picture is what they need to make an informed decision about their own life. He explained the stroke's resolution. He explained the functional assessments. He explained, without condescension, that the biological event Serrano feared had resolved, and that the limitation Serrano was experiencing now was not a limitation of the brain's function. Serrano listened, nodded in the right places, the nods of someone who understood the content and was not persuaded by it. Then Serrano said, quietly, with the dignity of a person who had thought about this more than the consulting surgeon had, "I understand what you are telling me. I just don't believe it yet." Nathan drove home thinking about that word. Yet Serrano had said it without drama, as a plain description of a gap that understanding alone could not close. Serrano understood the imaging reports. He had read them, and could explain them with the accuracy of a man who had spent 30 years teaching others to work with precision. The analytical picture was complete. The neurological facts were available and had been absorbed, and yet the believing that would allow him to live as a recovered person rather than a threatened one had not arrived, because believing was not an output of understanding. Believing was an output of accumulated experience, of enough ordinary days stacked against each other that the nervous system reclassified its evidence and updated the target. Time and experience were the mechanism. Neither yielded to effort or intelligence. Both required something Serrano was not yet willing to give, the willingness to act as if the new reality were true before the image had confirmed it. Nathan recognized the structure immediately. He had been asking himself to believe in a self-image that the evidence of his nervous system had not yet confirmed. He had been trying to install the belief through effort, rather than through the patient accumulation of the experience that would make the belief unnecessary. He and Serrano were in the same room, in different chairs. When a significant experience changes the circumstances of a person's life, 2 things exist simultaneously in the aftermath: the new circumstances and the old self-image. The old image does not update automatically when the new circumstances arrive. It updates through the accumulated lived experience of the new circumstances over enough time that the nervous system reclassifies the evidence, files it as the new baseline, and adjusts the target accordingly. Until then, the old image runs. It runs the correction it has always run. It generates the behavior it has always generated. And it does this with complete sincerity, because the image is not trying to be wrong. It is doing its job. Serrano's brain had healed. The image of a man whose brain could betray him at any moment, in any room without warning, had not healed. It was running its correction with the same efficiency it had always run it, keeping him close to walls, keeping him in rooms with other people present, generating, every time he moved toward the car or the classroom or the doorway of a space without a witness, the specific quality of signal the nervous system produces when the current behavior exceeds the safety parameters the image has set. Serrano was not irrational. He was not weak. He was a person whose self-image had received data from a terrifying experience and had incorporated that data with the same automatic impartiality with which it had incorporated every experience before. The image was running correctly. The target was simply set to the wrong thing. Nathan understood all of this. He had understood it before he walked into Serrano's room. What he had not understood, sitting across from Serrano and watching a man whose brain had healed spend his days in the behavioral patterns of a man whose brain had not, was how completely the new circumstances could be present without touching the image. The facts of the recovery were real. The imaging was clean. The function had returned. None of it had changed what the image believed was possible. That was not a story about Serrano. That was the story Nathan had been living for 4 weeks, in a different key. He had tried affirmations. This felt necessary to admit. Even in the accounting he kept only for himself, because affirmations were not something Nathan Cole would ordinarily try. They occupied a category he had always found unserious, the self-help equivalent of treating a systemic infection with a motivational poster. He had held them in this category for his entire adult life. He tried them because Maltz had written about them, and because he was, at this point, willing to try things outside his usual category of acceptable tools. He sat at the kitchen table and said, aloud, with whatever conviction he could produce, "I am a surgeon whose skill is the ground I stand on. I belong in every operating room I enter. My hands carry 22 years of work that nothing can take away." He said these things with the deliberate sincerity of someone who had decided to take the exercise seriously. He said them for 5 mornings. The hollowness was not in the words. The words were accurate. The statements were factually correct descriptions of a real state of affairs. The hollowness came from the gap between what the conscious mind was declaring and what the operating system was registering. The nervous system did not receive the affirmations as new data. It received them as communications from the conscious mind, which occupied a different position in the system's hierarchy of evidence than lived experience. The conscious mind could say whatever it wanted. The system knew the difference between a declaration and an event. You cannot paste a new image over an old one. The old image knows it is being pasted over, and the operating system, which has been running on the old image for 5 decades and has successfully defended that image against every attempt at significant change, is not moved by declarations of intent from a layer of consciousness that in the system's internal hierarchy arrived late to the party. Here was the paradox that Maltz had written about, and that Nathan was now living from the inside, in a way that no amount of reading had prepared him for. The self-image was installed by the automatic, pre-conscious processing of lived experience. The nervous system had filed the data from Nathan's specific history without being asked, without deliberate direction, below the threshold of his awareness. The data had gone in at the level where the automatic mechanism operated. And the automatic mechanism, by definition, could not be directly commanded by the conscious mind. You could not send instructions to the automatic mechanism the way you could send instructions to a technician. The automatic mechanism received its updates from experience, not from announcements, not from effort. When Nathan sat down and deliberately tried to visualize the confident surgeon, he was deploying the conscious mind against a task that had to be executed below the conscious mind, and the effort itself, the trying, the quality of controlled, deliberate straining that he brought to every difficult task in his life, created a layer of self-consciousness that the automatic mechanism could not run through. The torpedo navigating by automatic guidance could not navigate correctly while someone held the controls and insisted on steering manually. The more he tried, the more he interfered. The more he interfered, the more the performance broke. The more the performance broke, the more urgent the trying became. He was in a loop. The loop was self-sustaining, and the exit from the loop was not in the direction his training pointed. The exit was in the opposite direction. He was sitting in the hospital parking garage on a Thursday evening, engine off, not driving anywhere, when the specific shape of what he did not know became clear enough to look at directly. Every skill Nathan had built in 22 years was a skill of control. Precise, measurable, deliberate control. The control of the instrument in the hand, the control of the decision-making process under pressure, the control of the room, the economy of language, the calibrated confidence that held a team in coherent action during a procedure that did not forgive uncertainty. He had built his career on the reliable translation of intention into outcome. He knew how to want a result and produce it. He was, by any reasonable measure, exceptional at that translation. What was in front of him now was a problem that the translation could not solve. The image did not change because you wanted it to change and applied appropriate effort. The image changed through the accumulated lived experience of a different reality, real or vividly imagined, over enough time and with enough specificity that the nervous system reclassified its evidence and adjusted the target. The process was not a project. It was not a procedure with a protocol and a set of steps and a predictable endpoint. It could not be forced toward completion. He had to let it happen. And letting things happen, working without forcing the outcome, trusting a process that he could not control directly, was not a skill he had. This was not a deficiency. It was the predictable result of a training designed to eliminate that exact orientation from the practitioner. You did not let things happen in the OR. You made things happen. You controlled the variables. You held the instrument with the precisely correct pressure and moved it with the precisely correct angle, and the outcome followed from the precision of the execution. That relationship between controlled effort and reliable outcome was the foundation of everything he had built. The foundation was not wrong. It was the wrong foundation for this specific work, and standing at the edge of it, looking at the work that needed to be done, Nathan felt something he had not felt since his second year of residency. He felt genuinely lost, not the productive lostness of a problem not yet solved, the kind that a diagnostician experiences in the interval before the correct diagnosis arrives, and that has its own forward-facing quality. The more specific lostness of a person who has identified the problem and the solution, and attempted the solution with full commitment and technical rigor, and watched the attempt produce a worse outcome than the absence of any attempt. He knew what the target needed to become. He knew how the image needed to change. He knew, in more clinical detail than most people who had ever grappled with this material, the mechanism by which the change was supposed to occur. What he did not know was how to work in the way that change required. Without force, without the controlling hand on the instrument, without the reliable translation of intention into outcome, that was the only mode of operation his training had ever asked of him. Outside the parking garage, the city ran its own automatic corrections. Traffic adjusted to signals without anyone deciding to adjust it. Buildings held their shapes in the cold. The hospital above him was full of people applying the skills their training had given them, moving through the reliable translation of intention into outcome, doing the thing they had been built to do. Nathan Cole sat with his hands on the wheel of an unstarted car and held the question. There are problems that yield to effort. He had spent 22 years becoming exceptional at identifying them and solving them with care and precision. That exceptionalism was real. It was earned. It had served him and his patients well and would continue to serve them. It was, for this particular work, almost entirely beside the point. He sat in the dark of the parking garage and understood, for the first time in his professional life, that he had reached the edge of what his training could do. On the other side of that edge was something else. He did not know its name. He did not know its method. He knew only that everything he had tried so far had confirmed one thing with absolute consistency. The harder he pushed, the further away it got. Chapter 4. The direction changes. On what becomes possible the moment you stop working against the mechanism, there is a kind of effort that runs backward. The harder you push in that direction, the further from the destination you arrive. Every person who has ever tried to fall asleep at 3 a.m, by trying harder to fall asleep, has felt the specific reversal. The trying creates the wakefulness. The wakefulness makes the trying more urgent. The urgency deepens the wakefulness. The solution is never more effort in the same direction. The solution is a different relationship to the effort itself. Nathan understood this principle in every domain of his life, except the one that mattered most at this particular moment. He understood it in surgery, where you learned early that the surgeon who grips the instrument with maximum force has the worst control, and the surgeon who holds it with minimal tension has the most. He understood it in communication, where the resident who prepared so thoroughly for a difficult conversation that they recited it like a script consistently got a worse outcome than the one who understood the stakes and then put the preparation aside and simply talked. He had taught both of these principles to residents for 20 years. He had not applied either of them to himself. It arrived the way the most useful realizations arrive, not when he was looking for it, but when he was doing something else entirely. It was a Tuesday morning in early December, 5 weeks after the spinal procedure. He had been scheduled for a teaching session with second-year residents, a monthly exercise in which he demonstrated technique at the bench while the residents observed and asked questions. The session was low stakes by design, a space where questions were encouraged and errors in demonstration were part of the point. Nathan had run versions of this session for 15 years. He went in without preparation, without the deliberate morning visualization, without the 4-week program still running somewhere in the background of his mornings. He went in focused on the residents, on what they needed to see and understand, on the pedagogical problem, which was how to make the texture of a 22-year intuition legible to someone 8 months into their training. His attention was entirely outward, on the explanation, on the faces of the residents as the explanation landed or did not land. There was no attention left over for monitoring his own performance. The monitoring layer was simply not present. The demonstration ran for 40 minutes. His hands moved the way they moved before any of this had started. The story held. Not because he had prepared it to hold, but because the preparation for holding it was absent, and the automatic mechanism had run in the space the preparation usually occupied. He stood at the scrub sink afterward, alone, and understood what had just happened. Not understood it theoretically, felt it. The specific difference between a performance where the conscious monitoring layer is present and one where it is not was not something that could be fully conveyed in the language of mechanism and guidance system and servo-mechanism targets. It had to be felt from the inside. He had just felt it from the inside. And the feeling was the information. He went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table and did the visualization differently. Not differently in content, differently in quality. He did not sit down and build the image the way you build an argument or assemble a structure, piece by piece, checking each component for accuracy before adding the next. He sat down and relaxed. He let his hands go open on the table. He let his breathing find its own pace. He gave the conscious mind, which had been running the program for 5 weeks with the disciplined urgency of a person who had identified a problem and was going to fix it, permission to stand down. Then he let the image form rather than building it. The difference was the difference between making a fist and opening your hand, between holding a breath and releasing it. The deliberate construction created a performance that the nervous system knew was a performance, a staged image assembled by the conscious mind for the purpose of replacing an existing one, and the system treated it accordingly, as a declaration, not an event. The allowed image arrived differently. It arrived the way a memory arrives, unbidden from somewhere below the threshold of construction. It was still the same image, the oar, the table, the instruments, the Nathan who belonged there, but it came from a different direction. And the nervous system, which could distinguish a fabricated image from a remembered one with a reliability that no amount of conscious effort could override, filed it differently. He held the image for 12 minutes. It did not fragment. There is a distinction that matters here, and it is the distinction that determines whether this insight is useful or dangerous. The distinction is between releasing effort and abandoning the process. Abandoning the process looks like giving up. It is the decision to stop because the attempt is too difficult or the outcome too uncertain. It produces nothing. The process stops, and the old image continues running its correction without interference. Releasing effort looks like something different and feels like something different. It is the decision to continue the process while relinquishing the quality of straining control that has been making the process counterproductive. The intention remains. The commitment remains. The direction remains. What releases is the grip, the white-knuckled steering of the automatic mechanism by the conscious mind, which the automatic mechanism cannot run correctly while the conscious mind is insisting on driving. You release the controls, and the mechanism runs the way it was designed to run, automatically, below the threshold of conscious interference, aimed at the target. The target still has to be set. The practice still has to happen. The experience, real or vividly imagined, still has to accumulate. What releases is not the process. What releases is the quality of trying that was jamming the process's gears. Nathan had been confusing effort with engagement. They were not the same thing. Engagement was sustained attention and genuine care and full presence in the work. Effort, in the way he had been applying it, was the addition of a controlling force that the work did not need and could not use. He had been adding a force that subtracted from the outcome. Releasing it was not a retreat. It was a correction. 2 days later, he asked Torres to stay after rounds. They sat in the small conference room at the end of the surgical ward, where the attending physicians held conversations they did not want overheard. Nathan had spent an hour before this conversation thinking about how to begin it, and then had decided, with the specific application of the lesson he was learning, to stop planning how to begin it and simply begin. He told Torres about the servo-mechanism, not in those words, not with Maltz's framework or the language of cybernetics, but in the practical terms of what he had observed from the gallery in OR3, and what he had observed in himself over the past 5 weeks, and what he now understood about the relationship between the self-image and performance. He told it the way you tell a colleague something you have learned from your own case, with the particular authority and humility that comes from being both the diagnostician and the patient. Torres listened without interrupting. This was one of his qualities that Nathan had always appreciated. He listened with the stillness of someone who understood that most conversations were improved by saying less, and who had the confidence to trust that quality even when the conversation was about him. When Nathan finished, Torres was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So the target is set wrong." "The target is set wrong," Nathan said, "and every time I try to correct for it in the moment, I make it worse. Every time you try to correct for it through conscious effort in the moment, yes." Torres looked at the table. The particular quality of his silence was not defeat. It was the silence of a person integrating information that confirmed something they had sensed without being able to name. "I've been trying to perform my way out of it," he said. "More simulation hours, more case reviews, more deliberate preparation." "I know," Nathan said. "I watched you do it for 6 months and didn't understand what I was watching. What do I do instead?" It was the question Nathan had been sitting with for 5 weeks. And the answer he gave Torres was the answer he had only recently been able to give himself. You do not try to override the existing image through performance. You build new experience, real and imagined, that gradually accumulates enough evidence for the nervous system to update its target. You stop monitoring your own performance in the moment and trust the automatic mechanism to run. You act in the rooms where the image currently limits you, as the version of yourself you are building toward before the image has fully confirmed that version is real. Not as a performance, as a practice. The image updates through experience, Nathan said, not through declarations, not through trying harder, through the real lived experience of being the person the new image describes. You have to give the nervous system actual data. Torres thought about this, and until the image updates, you work with what you have. You go into the high-stakes cases and you focus on the patient and the procedure, not on your own performance. You put your attention where it belongs. The monitoring layer is what breaks the automaticity. Starve the monitoring layer by giving your attention somewhere more important. After Torres left, Nathan sat in the conference room for a few minutes. The advice he had given was accurate. He had given it with the authority of someone who had learned it. The learning had come from 5 weeks of getting it wrong, and from one Tuesday morning teaching session where he had accidentally gotten it right by not trying to get anything right at all. There is something that happens in the act of articulating a principle to another person that does not happen in the act of understanding it alone. The principle becomes external, takes on a shape that can be examined from outside rather than only felt from within. Nathan had understood the servo-mechanism, the target, the role of the automatic mechanism, the counterproductive nature of conscious effort applied to automatic processes. He had understood all of it from the inside, with the quality of understanding that comes from personal experience, with a concept rather than theoretical study of it. And then he had explained it to Torres, and in the explaining something had clarified that had remained slightly diffuse in the private understanding. The clarification was this: the principle was not about performing better. It was about being more accurately yourself. The image that needed to update was not a performance goal. It was an identity. And identities did not update through performance reviews or visualization programs run with the urgency of a person who had identified a defect and wanted it corrected. They updated through the patient accumulation of experience of being someone different, through the lived reality of inhabiting the new target often enough that the new target became the baseline. That distinction, performance versus identity, was the one he had been missing. Torres, by asking the right question in the right way, had created the space for Nathan to hear himself say it. The act as if principle is not a deception. This is the misunderstanding that makes people resistant to it. Acting as if sounds like pretending, like the hollow performance of a confidence you do not possess, like a lie told to yourself and to the room. It is none of those things. The principle is mechanical, not theatrical. When you act as the person your new self-image describes, before the image is fully updated, You are generating real experience of behaving in a new way. The nervous system does not distinguish between a performance and a genuine event at the level of the automatic mechanism. What it receives is data. Here is a moment in which this behavior occurred. Here is an experience of this person in this room acting in this way. The experience goes into the record. The record contributes to the target. The target adjusts incrementally toward the evidence. It is not pretending. It is practicing. The difference between pretending and practicing is internal. Pretending knows it is not real. Practicing is using the unrealized as training ground for the real. A surgeon in simulation is not pretending to operate. The surgeon is practicing operating, and the practice produces real change in the nervous system, and the real change in the nervous system produces real change in the OR, acting as if is simulation for the self-image. You run the simulation repeatedly, in real situations with real stakes, and you let the data accumulate. The image does not update because you told it to. It updates because the evidence eventually outweighs the old story. Nathan began in small places, a department meeting where the contested clinical opinion was his. He gave it without the new hesitation, with the directness that had always characterized his contributions before this had started. The opinion was received the way his opinions had always been received, as the opinion of someone whose judgment had been earned. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the point. The automatic mechanism ran. The performance matched the image of the surgeon who belonged in the room, and the nervous system filed a data point. He noticed, in the wake of it, that he had not monitored the room's reception while speaking. He had been fully present in the content of what he was saying, and the clinical reasoning behind it, and the monitoring of how the room received it had simply not competed for his attention. This was a reversal of what the previous weeks had felt like. The monitoring had been present the entire time then, running a simultaneous commentary on how the performance was going, and the commentary had been what introduced the tentativeness that Park had heard in the corridor after rounds. The monitoring had generated the tentativeness. The absence of the monitoring had generated the authority. The authority was not a performance. It was what happened when the performance was not happening. A teaching session the following week where he arrived without the deliberate visualization and went straight to the work and let the work carry the performance. Same result. The story held. Another data point, a consultation with a patient who needed the particular combination of technical clarity and human warmth that Nathan had always been able to provide, and that had been slightly muted for the past 6 weeks by the quality of self-consciousness the program had introduced. He gave the consultation the way he had given hundreds of consultations. The patient left the room with what they had come for. Another data point. Each of these was small. Each was real. None of them proved that the image had updated. What they proved was that the automatic mechanism could run correctly when Nathan was not interfering with it, and that the interference was not structural. It was a habit, and habits could be changed by the accumulation of different habits. The servo-mechanism was not broken. The target was adjusting. He could feel it adjusting, the way you can feel a room warming before the temperature has reached comfort, a directional change before the destination arrives. Here is what makes real experience different from visualization as a feed for the servo-mechanism, and why both are necessary. Visualization works because the nervous system cannot distinguish between a real experience and a vividly imagined one. This is powerful and real, and it is the foundation of every mental rehearsal protocol used by athletes, surgeons, musicians, and anyone else who has discovered that the nervous system can be trained below the threshold of physical action. But it operates at one level of the system. Real experience operates at every level simultaneously. When Nathan gave the clinical opinion without hesitation in the department meeting, the experience was not processed only by the imaging system. It was processed by his body, which registered the act of speaking with full authority in that room. It was processed by the feedback he received, the nods, the quality of attention in the room, the sense of the contribution landing where it was aimed. It was processed by his memory, which filed it as an event that had occurred, not an event that had been imagined. The nervous system weighted it accordingly. Real experience and vivid imagination are not competing methods. They are complementary inputs to the same mechanism. Visualization builds the target in the absence of the real situation. Real experience confirms the target when the real situation arrives. The image update requires both, running simultaneously each reinforcing what the other has established. Nathan needed to feed the mechanism from both directions. He was. The data was accumulating. The target was moving. The procedure was scheduled for a Thursday in the second week of December. A complex posterior fossa resection, the kind of surgery that the OR staff did not call the needle but that occupied the same category. Technically demanding, margin for error narrow, outcome highly dependent on the quality of the surgeon's attention at specific moments in the procedure. Nathan had not performed this specific approach in 4 months. He had performed the underlying technique hundreds of times. He entered the OR without the deliberate morning construction. He had done the visualization the night before. Relaxed, allowed rather than built, 12 minutes in the kitchen with his hands open on the table. That was complete. What he brought to the OR was not a performance he had prepared. It was a direction he had set and then released. Park ran the pre-op checklist. The responses were correct. The room assembled itself around the procedure, the way OR rooms assembled themselves, efficiently without ceremony, each person occupying their function. Nathan stepped to the table and reached for the first instrument without looking. The story held. Not held in the sense of being maintained through effort. Held in the sense of simply being present, the way a wall holds when no one is pushing against it. The narrative of the surgeon who belonged at this table was not something Nathan had to construct or defend in the first 20 minutes of the procedure. It was simply true, running below the threshold of monitoring, the automatic mechanism executing the target the image had set with 22 years of accumulated precision. There was a moment, at the 40-minute mark, when the approach required a micro-adjustment that Nathan had not anticipated from the pre-operative imaging. The kind of moment where the procedure presents you with a decision that is not in the protocol, where the training and the judgment and the specific quality of presence that distinguishes the surgeon from the technician is the only resource available. He made the adjustment. He made it cleanly, with the unhurried certainty that had characterized his work before any of this had started. What the moment required was not the deliberate assertion of competence. What it required was the specific quality of presence that Nathan understood now as the absence of the monitoring layer rather than the achievement of a particularly alert conscious state. The decision came from the automatic mechanism, from the 22 years of training that had built a capacity for exactly this kind of judgment. The self-image had a vote in whether the automatic mechanism was allowed to run. It did not have a vote in what the automatic mechanism did once it was running. Nathan had spent 6 weeks learning to give the automatic mechanism permission. In this moment, the permission was present. The mechanism ran. The micro-adjustment was exactly correct. Park handed him the next instrument without being asked, which meant she had read the adjustment correctly from her position and had anticipated his next move. He completed the procedure in his standard time. He walked out of the OR and stood in the corridor and felt something he had not felt in 6 weeks. Not triumph, something quieter and more durable than triumph. The specific ease of a person doing what they were built to do, without interference from the layer that had been doing the interfering. He wrote one line in the legal pad that evening. The mechanism runs when I get out of its way. This was not a conclusion. It was an observation about a direction, the way a navigator's first confirmed bearing is not a destination, but the beginning of a course. The image had not fully updated. The target had moved but had not arrived at where it needed to be. The thermostat was not yet set to the new number. What had changed was the quality of the work. He understood now that he could not force the update, and that the forcing had been the primary obstacle, and that removing the obstacle did not produce instant arrival, but it produced movement, and movement after 6 weeks of stillness was not a small thing. He thought about Torres, who had listened in the conference room with the particular quality of attention that Nathan recognized as the attention of someone for whom the information had arrived at exactly the right moment. Torres had a harder road ahead than Nathan, not because the mechanism was more entrenched, but because he was younger, and the pattern had less history to it, and therefore less authority, and the less authority a pattern had, the more invisible it was, and the invisible ones were the hardest to work on because you could not see them clearly enough to release them. Nathan had the advantage of age and crisis. The crisis had made the pattern visible. The visibility was the prerequisite for everything else. The legal pad had 43 pages of notes from the past 6 weeks. He had not looked at most of them since writing them. He looked at them now from the last page backward, and what he saw was the record of a person moving from the wrong application of a correct diagnosis towards something that had not yet arrived but was no longer theoretical. The work was not done. It would not be done for some time, and the honesty of that assessment was itself a quality he had learned from the work. The image updated at the pace of genuine experience, not at the pace of desire, and there was no method available for accelerating genuine experience beyond what it was. But the direction had changed, and the direction was everything. He closed the legal pad and set it on the night table next to his phone. Outside, the Boston December ran its cold and reliable operations. The building hummed. Somewhere above him, the hospital was performing its continuous work. Nathan Cole lay in the dark, with the quiet, specific weight of a person who has been lost and is no longer lost, who does not yet know the exact shape of where they are going, but knows, with a certainty that does not require confirmation, that they are going somewhere real. The legal pad on the nightstand held 43 pages of the wrong application of a correct diagnosis. What came next would be written in a different quality of ink, not the urgent scratching of someone trying to think their way out of a problem that thinking could not solve, but the steadier marks of someone who had found the direction and was learning day by day to walk in it without gripping. Chapter 5. The Thing That Changed. On what remains when the work is done and the image finally matches the person, the things that change you permanently do not always announce themselves. Most events people name as transformative arrive with the full weight of their category already attached, entering them, that they are the kind of event that changes things. You prepare for the change, brace for it, or welcome it, or move toward it with the deliberate intention of being changed. The changes that go deepest arrive differently. They arrive in the middle of ordinary things, during the third cup of coffee, or the drive to work, or the second week of a month you will later remember as the month everything settled. You cannot say on which exact day the cold finally stopped being the primary fact of the air. The warmth accumulates across days that do not individually announce themselves as the day. And then one morning you walk outside and the season has turned, and you understand that it turned slowly and completely and without ceremony, and that the not having a ceremony was part of what made it real. Nathan would not be able to say later on which exact morning in January the new baseline became the baseline. The change had been accumulating for weeks in department meetings and consultations and/or mornings where the story held not because he was holding it, but because it simply was. At some point the accumulation had crossed a threshold that had no ceremony attached to it. The new self-image was not installed on a specific date. It arrived the way weather arrives, gradually, then completely. He noticed it first not in the ore but in the way he occupied rooms. He had always been an unhurried person, had built that quality deliberately against a temperament that ran fast and hot. But unhurried and present were not the same thing, and for the past 6 weeks he had been both, in a way that he had not been both for longer than he could accurately locate. The unhurried quality had always been a technique, a managed presentation of calm. What he felt now was different. Not the management of anxiety, but the absence of a specific kind of vigilance he had been carrying so long he had stopped knowing it was weight. Park mentioned it. Not directly, which was not her style. She mentioned it obliquely, in the way surgeons mention things when they are not sure the mention is appropriate, by referring to something adjacent to it. She said after a complex teaching case in the second week of January that the residents had responded well. Not to the case, to him. They ask better questions when you're like this, she said, and did not elaborate on what like this meant, and Nathan did not ask her to, because he understood exactly what she meant and did not need it named, like this, present without the vigilance. Available for the work, without the simultaneous availability for the monitoring of the work. He had been monitoring his own performance for so long, and so automatically, that the monitoring had become indistinguishable from the performance itself. The two had merged into a single continuous operation. Doing the work and evaluating the doing of the work, running simultaneously one above the other, the evaluation layer producing the tentativeness that Park had heard in the corridor after rounds and that Torres had been producing in his high-stakes procedures for as long as Nathan had been watching. The evaluation layer was gone now, not suppressed, gone. It had been fed enough evidence of the person it had been monitoring that the monitoring was no longer necessary. The image update did not confine itself to the OR. Nathan had been prepared for it to confine itself to the OR, had been prepared for the work to produce a specific clinical improvement in a specific clinical domain and leave everything else unchanged. That was not what happened. He called his ex-wife in early January about a tax matter that required both of their signatures on a document. They had not spoken in 14 months. The conversation had a texture that neither of them referenced, but that both of them registered, a quality of ease in his voice that had not been present in the final years of the marriage. Not a new ease. A recovered one, or more precisely a made-available one, the ease of a person who was no longer simultaneously managing the gap between who they were and what the image said they were allowed to be. She mentioned at the end of the call that he sounded well. He said that he was. He meant it without qualification. On a Wednesday in the third week of January, Nathan performed a 7-hour posterior lateral approach for the resection of a meningioma classified as borderline operable by 2 other surgical teams at 2 other institutions. He had taken the case because the patient was 41 years old and had been told by 2 teams that the risk-to-benefit ratio was unfavorable. And Nathan had looked at the imaging and disagreed. Not with the technical assessment of the difficulty, with the conclusion that the difficulty made the case inadvisable. The difficulty made the case challenging. The patient's age and the tumor's location made the case necessary. Those were different things and the distinction mattered. He entered the OR the way he had entered ORs for 22 years before any of this had started. He stepped to the table. The instruments were arranged to his left in the order he preferred. He reached for the first one without looking, the story held, not as a hard-won achievement, not as the product of weeks of deliberate work on the image and the target and the mechanism. It held the way a well-made structure holds, because it had been built correctly and the building was complete, and now it simply stood. The procedure required 7 hours and the management of 3 significant intraoperative challenges. At 90 minutes in, the tissue presentation deviated from the preoperative imaging in a way that required a full reassessment of the approach. Nathan reassessed in the specific quality of silence that the OR generates when the surgeon stops talking and the room understands that something is being worked out. He worked it out. The reassessment took 4 minutes. The new approach was cleaner than the original. At 4 hours, an unexpected vessel required management that was not in the standard protocol for this approach. He managed it without significant deviation from the timeline. At 6 hours, exhaustion entered the room the way it enters every long procedure, a flattening of the light and a heaviness in the standing. And Nathan acknowledged it and continued, which was what you did. Each adaptation came from the automatic mechanism, from 22 years of judgment, running without conscious interference, from the part of his capability that the self-image had been undervaluing for as long as he could remember, and that now finally ran at full authorization. The patient came off the table with the tumor resected and the function intact. Park said nothing after the procedure. Nathan had been fully present for 7 hours and knew precisely what the case had required and what had been given, and the knowing was clean and uncluttered by either false modesty or excessive satisfaction. He had done the work the case required. He was the person who could do that work. Both things were true, and they were not in tension with each other. The work Nathan had done over the previous 8 weeks was not the work of replacing himself. This distinction matters because the way self-image change is usually presented suggests a wholesale demolition and reconstruction. Destroy the limiting beliefs, install the empowering ones. Arrive at the other end as an entirely different person with an entirely different story. That is not what Maltz described. It is not what Nathan experienced. The work was repair, not replacement. The self that had been running on the old target was not wrong in its entirety. Most of Nathan Cole was accurate and functional and genuinely his. The surgical skill was real. The clinical judgment was real. The quality of care he brought to patients and residents and to the specific human texture of difficult conversations was real. The father's silence and the second-year fellowship and the marriage that ended with an exhalation had contributed to an image that underestimated one specific and significant dimension of what Nathan was capable of. Not all dimensions. 1. Repair addresses the specific fault. It does not require demolishing the structure. It requires identifying the fault accurately, understanding how it developed, and doing the work of correction with the patience and precision that significant fault repair demands. Nathan had done that work. The structure was intact. The fault was addressed. The image now described the person more accurately than it had before. This is what Maltz meant by self-image change. Not a self-help transformation, a recalibration. The instrument had always been capable of accurate measurement. It had been reading slightly low. The adjustment did not create a new instrument. It made the existing one read correctly. He received the note from the neurology team in the second week of January. Serrano had returned to teaching. He had started driving in December, short distances at first, the grocery store and the pharmacy, and once, at the end of the month, the full 20-minute commute to the school and back without stopping. In January, he had gone back to his mathematics classroom and had taught differential equations to 17-year-olds who did not know anything about what had happened to him, and who needed someone to explain the relationship between rates of change and the behavior of physical systems. The neurology note described this as successful reintegration into pre-morbid functional activities. Nathan read it in the specific language of clinical documentation and understood it differently. The image had updated. Enough accumulated ordinary days without the brain betraying him had produced enough evidence for the nervous system to reclassify the baseline, adjust the target, and authorize the behavior that matched the target. Serrano had not decided to believe he was recovered. He had lived, day by day and week by week, in the direction of the recovery being real. The living had eventually produced the believing. Nathan thought about the afternoon in Serrano's room. The word yet. I understand what you are telling me. I just don't believe it yet. The yet had been the most honest word in the conversation, and Serrano had known it was honest and had said it anyway, which was itself a kind of bravery that Nathan had not fully registered at the time but registered now. To say not yet rather than not ever was to hold the door open. It required believing that the believing would eventually arrive even before there was evidence that it would. Serrano had crossed the distance between understanding and believing by accumulating ordinary days. Nathan had crossed it by understanding the mechanism well enough to stop interfering with it. Different routes, the same destination. The nervous system's capacity for updating its evidence, and therefore its target, and therefore its behavior, was not particular to surgeons or to mathematicians or to any specific kind of person. It was structural. It was available to everyone. The image could be updated. That was Maltz's finding and Serrano's and Nathan's, and the finding was consistent across all three. The most significant thing Nathan had learned from the 8 weeks was not about the self-image specifically. It was about the nature of the self. We treat the self as a fixed structure, a given, something determined at some point through some combination of genetics and experience and character, which now constitutes the permanent fact of what a person is. We speak about ourselves in the language of fixtures. I am this way. I am not that way. This is who I am. The language suggests permanence, completion, the settled facthood of a structure that has been built and occupied. The self is not a structure. It is a process. It runs continuously, updates continuously, files new evidence, and adjusts its parameters in response to that evidence. What we call who I am is more accurately described as who my self-image currently describes, and the self-image is not a permanent document. It is a living one, updated by every experience and every interpretation of every experience, moment by moment across a lifetime. This does not make the self unstable. The accumulated weight of 50 years of experience gives the image a momentum that resists casual disruption. You cannot accidentally revise a self-image that has been running for decades. The revision requires sustained and deliberate work over time, but the revision is possible. It is always possible. Because the document is living, it can be amended. The amendment is demanding and patient work. Nathan would argue now that it was the most important work a person could do, not because it produced better results, though it did, because it produced a more accurate life. He had learned 4 things that he had not known before this started, and that he could not now imagine unknowing. The first was that the self-image and the capability were separate things, running on different levels of the same system, and the gap between them was not destiny. The capability had been his the entire time. What had been limiting it was not a limitation of the capability itself, but a limitation of the image's willingness to authorize the capability to run at its full level. The authorization had changed. The capability had not. It had been waiting. The second was that effort was not the universal tool he had spent 22 years treating it as. Effort was appropriate for some problems and counterproductive for others, and the ability to distinguish between the two was not a skill his training had given him. His training had given him the ability to apply effort with extraordinary precision and consistency. It had not given him the wisdom to recognize when the application of effort was making the problem worse. That wisdom had cost him 6 weeks of exactly the wrong kind of work, and the cost had been worth it, because you cannot be given that wisdom from the outside. It has to be learned. The third was that the mechanism had never been his enemy. It had been running correctly the whole time, correcting toward the target the image had set, doing exactly what it was designed to do. The problem had never been the mechanism. The problem had been the target, and the target could be changed. The fourth was the most important and the most difficult to articulate, without reducing it to something smaller than it was. You could not think your way to a new self-image. You had to live your way there. The living required patience and consistency, and the willingness to accumulate experience of being someone different before you fully believed you were someone different. It required a kind of faith that was not about belief but about behavior, acting in the direction of the new image before the image had fully confirmed that the direction was available. Nathan had done this. Serrano had done this. Anyone who had ever genuinely changed had done this, whether or not they had the framework to name what they were doing. The question from the beginning had been, if everything you know about yourself was assembled by the same mind that just froze, how much of it is actually true? He had been carrying that question for 8 weeks. He had an answer. Most of it was assembled by that mind. The self-image of Nathan Cole had been constructed by the same nervous system that had generated the freeze, the same system that had built the thermostat setting from a father's silence and a second-year failure and a marriage that ended with an exhalation. The construction had been done in good faith, with the data available, by a mechanism that was working correctly with the inputs it had received. None of the inputs had been chosen. None of the interpretations had been deliberate. The assembly had happened automatically, below the threshold of awareness, by a system that did not evaluate what it filed. It simply filed. So how much of it was true? Most of it. The capability was real. The clinical judgment was real. The care was real. The 22 years of work that had produced a surgical record that a department chair could call exceptional was real. The specific quality of presence Nathan brought to patients in the most frightening moments of their lives was real, and it was not manufactured by the image. It was generated by the person, and the person had been there the whole time. What the image had assembled that was not real as a description of Nathan Cole in January under the full weight of what he had built and who he had become, was one story about one dimension of one person. The story of a man who got close to the rooms where the highest level work happened and did not quite get in. That story had been true for the second-year resident who did not receive the fellowship. It had been true for a specific chapter of a specific life. It had been filed as permanent when it was not permanent. It was a story about a moment, extended by the image's filing system into something that looked like a structural fact. The question was never how much of what you know about yourself is true. Most of it is true. The question is which parts are descriptions of permanent fact, and which parts are interpretations of moments that hardened into identity when the filing system could not distinguish between the two. The question was never how much of what you know about yourself is true. Most of it is true. The question is, which parts are descriptions of permanent fact, and which parts are interpretations of moments that hardened into identity when the filing system could not distinguish between the two. The filing system accepted everything with equal impartiality. A surgical outcome and a father's single expression of pride in a parking lot were filed with the same quiet efficiency. A marriage's moments of genuine connection and a marriage's moments of chosen absence were filed the same way. The system did not label some entries as evidence and others as interpretation. It filed them all as data and weighted them by emotional intensity and repetition. The most emotionally charged experiences received the most structural weight. The most often revisited interpretations became the most influential. None of this was malicious. It was the system working correctly with the inputs it received. The inputs could be changed. The re-weighting could be done. Not by arguing with the filing system, but by giving it different things to file. That distinction between fact and hardened interpretation was the territory. The territory could be mapped. What could be mapped could be revised. What could be revised did not have to be lived inside forever. This was what Maltz had been trying to say for 40 years, what Nathan had spent 8 weeks learning to receive. The self-image is not your destiny. It is your current operating parameter. It is the number the thermostat is set to, and the number can be changed, not easily, not quickly, not through declaration or affirmation or the kind of positive thinking that mistakes announcement for evidence, through experience. Real experience, or experience so vividly and specifically imagined that the nervous system cannot distinguish it from real, through the patient accumulation of data that contradicts the old story often enough, and consistently enough that the nervous system reclassifies its evidence and moves the target. The work is demanding. It requires more patience than most people are trained to bring to it, because most people are trained the way Nathan was trained. Identify the problem, apply the appropriate effort, produce the result. The effort and results model works for most of the problems a person encounters in a life. It does not work for this one. This one requires a different quality of engagement, sustained, patient, below the level of straining control, aimed at accumulating experience rather than forcing change, but it is available. To everyone who is willing to do it, it is available. Not because human nature is more malleable than it appears. Because the self-image was constructed, and constructed things can be revised, and the revision is the most important work a person can do. Not because a more accurate self-image produces better results, though it does. Because a more accurate self-image produces a more accurate life, a life in which the gap between what you are capable of and what the image authorizes you to attempt is small enough that you are actually living the life that belongs to you, rather than a carefully edited version of it. That was Maltz's real thesis. Not self-improvement, self-accuracy. Nathan went back to the kitchen window, not on any particular morning with any particular significance attached to it. It was a habit now, the standing at the window with the coffee while the city ran its morning operations below. He had done it on the morning before the first freeze, and on the morning after, and on every weekday morning in between, and the view had not changed, the intersection, the runner with hands on his knees, the pigeons, but the person standing at the window had, not because the person had been replaced. Because the person was more accurately himself. The image Nathan Cole had carried of Nathan Cole for 51 years had contained, in its architecture, one significant inaccuracy, the load-bearing wall that said the highest rooms were not for him. Not because he was unable, because something in the history of the construction had placed that wall. And the wall had been standing so long it had been mistaken for a structural element rather than a later addition, and removing it had required understanding first that it was there at all. Which had taken a 3-second freeze in a hospital library, and a resident who asked the right questions and a mathematics teacher who had found his way back to his classroom. He would not have found what he found without all of it. The path had been the path. There was no version where the learning arrived without the losing. What remained now? What sat in him, with the specific quality of permanence that marks the things a person cannot unknow, was not a technique or a program or a set of instructions for maintaining the new image against the old one's return. What remained was simpler and harder to name and more durable than any technique, the knowledge that the image and the person were not the same thing. Not as an intellectual possession, the way you possess a framework or a model that you can consult when needed and set aside when not. As a lived understanding, the kind that does not require consulting notes because it has become part of how the person moves through rooms, takes on cases, holds conversations, encounters the specific moments in a life where what you are capable of and what the image has decided you are capable of either align or diverge. Nathan would recognize the divergence now. He would know what he was looking at. He would know what the work required. That knowledge was not removable. That the question. If everything you know about yourself was assembled by the same mind that froze, how much of it is actually true, was not a threat and not a verdict. It was an invitation. An invitation to look at the assembly, to distinguish the evidence from the story, to locate the moments that had been filed as permanent fact and ask, with the patience of someone who understood what the asking required, whether permanent fact was what they actually were. He drank his coffee. Below, the runner at the intersection caught his breath and ran on. The pigeons resolved their dispute without ceremony. The cab moved through without stopping. Nathan Cole stood at the window of his kitchen and occupied the room, fully and without vigilance, and felt the specific weight of a self-image that finally matched the person it described, It was not triumph. Triumph was loud and temporary, a weather event, and it passed. This was quieter. This would last. This was the thing that changed.